So yeah, as I said, my name's Rennie Mason. I am one of countryside rangers for Whitelee Windfarm, where I've been for 12 years now, having started in 2010. There were 2 rangers, myself and my colleague, when I first started, and we're now actually up to 3 rangers. So my plan for the talk is just to tell you very briefly a bit about the wind farm, about its development, a wee bit about what we do, and then obviously focus in on the wildlife of the site, ecology, some information about the forestry and other things that go on in the site, and with a focus on what's called the Whitelee Habitat Management Group as well. So as we say, if there's any questions, if we can keep them to the end, because otherwise I have a terrible tendency to overrun in these things, but I will do my best to try and keep to things. So just to start, obviously this is a photograph of part of Whitelee Windfarm, and hopefully you can see my cursor moving on the screen just now. So just to give you kind of a few things, this area up here is where Whitelee Visitor Centre is based. And basically the wind farm is it's the largest in the UK, onshore wind farm in the UK, and it's the 2nd largest in Europe. Basically there's 215 turbines spread out over an area of roughly 30.3 square miles. And what that does is it's obviously generating electricity from the turbines. This one site is rated at 539 megawatts, which means if it's running at full power with all the machines on at the same time, it will be generating enough electricity for roughly 350,000 homes. When I started here, it was only 320 turbines, and it's increased over time. And in fact, the number of houses that the wind farm supplies went up by 50,000 last year, through nothing that the wind farm did, but by energy saving measures that have actually came in. So as I say, largest onshore wind farm in the UK, and when it was actually planned, it took roughly 10 years from initial concept through planning until delivery on the ground, with the first energy was actually supplied in 2008, but the official opening wasn't until 2009, and myself and my colleague as the rangers for the site, we started in 2010. When it was first envisaged, this wind farm was actually going to be able to produce about 2.5% of all of Scotland's electricity needs just from this one wind farm. So this is a map of the whole site itself, and up in this area here, as I say, this is where the visitor centre is, and the electricity for the site leaves at a point down here called Ardagh, and that's actually the substation for the wind farm. So as you can see, turbines are spread out through that area, and on the map here, the green areas represent the forestry at that point in time. This map's actually a couple of years old now, and as I'll come on to later, there's a lot of changes within the forestry as it goes. The map itself, this is one of the things that we, the Countryside Rangers, as part of what's called the Whitelee Access project, have delivered. The idea being to try and produce interpretation materials and things to assist people come up and actually to make use of the wind farm. Other types of things we do is we obviously run education programs, we run free activities and events for members of the public. We do outreach work because this wind farm actually straddles 3 council areas. So you basically have East Renfrewshire in this area up here, East Ayrshire down this section here, and then in a small pocket over here, you have South Lanarkshire as well. And basically our kind of role in things, as I say, is by hook or by crook, is to try and get people up to use the access opportunities that the wind farm presents. And a big reason for that is because during the initial consultation for the wind farm, the local community said, you know, one of the things they wanted to see was access benefits, so that if you could basically do something under the Scottish Outdoor Access Code, you would be able to come to the wind farm and to do it there. And from that came what's called the Whitelee Access Project. and within that the Whitelee Ranger Service. There's also a group called the Whitelee Access Planning Group, which is basically we have quarterly meetings. The group is made up of all the vested interests in the site. So you have the wind farm developer and operator, you have Forestry Commission, Scottish Water, some of the private landowners, as well as community involvement there as well. So it's a busy group that basically looks at all the various aspects of the wind farm, but with a particular focus on public access. You may have noticed some of the little yellow circles appearing on the map. So what I was going to do this next part is just give you a potted history to do with the Whitelee area, the Whitelee Plateau. Prior to the wind farm, there was a belief that the area wasn't greatly used by members of the public, but when you actually look back in the history of the site, which is something we use to engage with the public, you actually find there's a tremendous amount of history associated with the area. So the first photograph here is, this is actually the visitor centre, which is located on Queen Seat Hill. And the hill actually gets its name from, it's supposedly one of the spots that Mary Queen of Scots stopped at after the Battle of Langside to take stock of what had happened before moving on. This next one is a short distance, maybe about 15 minutes walk from the visitor centre. This flat-topped hill is known as Dunwan Hill, and it's reputed to be the location of an Iron Age hill fort, or what's more likely, and certainly speaking to a local archaeologist, what's more likely it is a fortified dwelling. There were two earth and moat walls, or earth and stone walls, that ran around the hill itself. And then at the top of it, there's actually two circular depressions still on the ground. And these were believed to have been timber-built circular dwellings that were on the top of the hill. Chosen because it's a fantastic vantage point for the area and easily defended. And that, as I say, dated right back to the Iron Age. There's, within the local area, there's a lot of Bronze Age history dotted around as well. Just next to Dunwan Hill, there's another hill called Blackwood Hill, where we actually have a viewpoint installation. And just on the side of that, you have the remains of what was Blackwood Farmstead. Apparently abandoned in the 1970s because it didn't meet the requirements at that time for habitation. It kept running for a couple more years, used for keeping livestock and as a grain store and things like that. But basically, it was abandoned. And the wind farm has a number of these old steadings going right back. One in particular that I'll talk about in a wee minute, which has this monument right next to it. This is the Covenanters Monument, which is right next door to a place called Lochgoyne Farm. And Lochgoyne Farm, on the lintel of the farmhouse, has a number of dates inscribed into it going back to the 1100s, which is when the Huys moved to the area from France. And about 400 years later, they became embroiled with the what was known as the killing times for the Covenanters. So this is the Covenanters Monument, and that was myself, a wee bit younger, in what is known as the Covenanters Cave, which is actually just outside of the wind farm. And the whole area of Whitelee Plateau over to Straven, Drumclog, Fenwick has a really, really strong connection with the Covenanters. A little bit of more recent history. This is a monument to an unfortunate soul called Sub-Lieutenant Walter Maw, who was a 21-year-old pilot with RAF. And in 1944, during thick fog, he unfortunately flew his aircraft and it ploughed into the bog. In 1997, not long before the wind farm came about, the RAF Benevolent Trust came up to the site and actually erected this cross and memorial to him. And at the same time, they actually recovered several parts of the aircraft, which then went off to aviation museums. I must admit, I've been trying to get hold of some of the bits for some years now, but unfortunately, nobody knows where they actually ended up. This strange one here, this is a memorial to a lady called Euphemia White. She was a local of the area sometime in the 1800s, and her husband was basically a local tax collector. And there's a memorial to her and her husband found nestling in the Windfarm. Very ornate, very expensive. What you have is a needlepoint obelisk surrounded by a wrought iron fence with evergreen trees planted in amongst it. And certainly in Victorian times, evergreens were planted around kind of graveyards and commemorative sites like this, because the evergreens were supposed to kind of represent everlasting life. And the final oddity here, this is a cairn over towards the South Lanarkshire end of the Windfarm, which locally with some people is known as the Viking Princess Cairn. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever of Vikings have been in the area, and part of the rumour comes from the fact that when you trace out from the cairn itself, there's actually a like a Norse wheel structure of stone is on the ground, and from that people have made an association to the Vikings. What I actually found more interesting is there's an extremely old bottle of whiskey wedged in one side of the cairn. I would not touch it though. So that's just a little potted history of some of the points in the Windfarm, just to illustrate and hope that, you know, the area has always been used by people. But what's actually happened is through the introduction of the Windfarm, and from that, what's called the Whitelee Access Project we're part of, the use of that site is obviously increased substantially. And our main role, as I was saying earlier, is really to, bring people to the Windfarm, to let them use the access opportunities that the Windfarm presents, to help facilitate that, and through the work that we do to try and aid people and to bring them to the site. So as I say, to do that, what we've actually done is we ran events, we put out interpretation materials, access guides, events programs, we do outreach work, talks, obviously things like this. And then on top of that, we do site maintenance, we do small conservation projects and things like this as well. So this just gives you an idea of a couple of things that we do. The top left photograph is one of the waymarker posts. We've got one of the most complex waymarker post systems probably in the country. The reason for that is there is something like 130 kilometres of wind farm tracks, forest rides, old rights of way, old farm roads and all the rest of it, all crisscrossing and interconnecting. And so to try and facilitate access and make it easier for people, waymarker posts have been put in along with the map that we were looking at earlier. And in fact, in every single one of these waymarker posts, if you have a smartphone, there's a QR code on it as well, which takes you to a site map as well. Also on the photographs is some of the activities we do. So bottom left is one of the school groups we had. The one at the top in the centre was a bivouacking event we did for families. And top right is our stroller group. We've been running a stroller striders group for new mums and parents that's been running since 2011 with literally hundreds of young children and babies. And I'm actually scared to admit that some of them now come along to some of our children's activities, and I've seen them grow up. Some of the other things we do, however, is we help facilitate larger events. So the likes of the photograph of the horse there is from a British Horse Society event. And then below that, you have the logo for the Run the Blades endurance race, which is a 10K, a half marathon and a 50K event. And basically the Access Project and the Ranger Service have been instrumental in getting these types of activities in the Windfarm, because what we do is we act as a liaison between the likes of the event applicants, the Windfarm operators, the various landowners and things like that. So we're very much there, as I say, to try and kind of facilitate the access opportunities of the Windfarm. And one of the big things that people do come to the site for is the wildlife interest of the site. So this was a photograph of a short-eared owl, managed to capture a few years ago now. in the setting of the wind farm. There is no statutory designations, and there were no statutory designations in the area of the wind farm prior to construction, so no triple SIs, SPAs, anything like that. There was local authority SINC designation, so Site of Importance for Nature Conservation, and that was based on the moorland bird species that were found within the wind farm. And when it came to the kind of pre-planning stage, there was obviously phase 1 and NVC botanical surveys that took place, and that was then fed into the planning application. And through that, there were 22 different habitat types that were actually identified in the site, but these were actually broadly grouped down into 7 kind of main habitat types, which were your coniferous plantations, blanket bog, dry modified, wet modified bog. They basically all got amalgamated into peat bog, and then your grasslands, including marshy grasslands, neutral grasslands, semi-improved, things like that. And that was so that they could be looking at them in terms of the management of the site. The largest habitat type was the conifer plantation, which is composed of non-native spruce trees primarily, and there was roughly about 3,200 hectares of that. However, the fact of the matter is that forestry plantation actually overlies the peat bog in those areas as well. So the biggest habitat really, if you can ignore the trees, so to speak, is the different bog habitats that are to be found there. And keeping with the forestry side of things, so Whitelee Forest was envisaged by, at that time, Forestry Commission Scotland. In about 1961, they were tasked with finding low productivity areas where tree planting could go ahead. And what they did was they basically started approaching farmsteads, landowners on the Whitelee Plateau, looking for any arable land of low productivity and buying that up and starting the planting of Whitelee Forest. This is some of the photographs from the time that shows some of the machines starting to excavate the drains and the grips needed to lower the water table for the trees. What you can see in the bottom 2 photographs is one of the hazards of working with a heavy machine on a very soft substrate. The majority of the peat bog in Whitelee is blanket bog, which means it's 97% water content, 3% organic matter. And I know that there are 2 what is called dumpy tractors. So that's the little chap you can see poking out the peat in the bottom left. 2 of them are permanent residents of the peat bog. Apparently when the first one went down, they pulled in every machine in Scotland and dug it out, but it took almost a week. And after that, if a machine went down, they basically, that was it, it was written off. What they started to do at that point was they would have the machines working in tandem so that if one of them got into trouble, the other one could hopefully help to pull it out. This gives you a little idea of some of the forestry at Whitelee. There was roughly, by the time the main planting of the site was completed, it was around about the early 1990s, and by that point there was over 10 million trees had been planted. The main species that was used was non-native Sitka spruce. There's also Norway spruce, occasional fir trees, and some small pockets of native broadleaf trees as well. The bulk of it was on long rotation, so once getting up to about kind of 25 to 40 years before they were even considering the harvesting. However, obviously harvesting of the timber is very much driven by what the market is doing at that time. And certainly between 2001 and 2007, there was between 15 and I think 17,000 tons of timber a year were being taken, which is fairly modest when you consider within the wind farm there's about 3,000 hectares of forestry, but Whitelee Forest actually extends well beyond the boundaries of the wind farm. and ranges, I think the total area size is about 5,500 hectares. What you can see in there as well is the locations of the turbines, and what the change that came about with the introduction of the wind farm was to a radius of about 100 meters round about the turbines, the trees would only be allowed on short rotation crops. And basically what that means is the trees don't get to be above about 12 meters in height. The reason for that being that once they get bigger, they start to create a lot more turbulence, which affects the turbines and reduces their efficiency. And the other thing you can see in the photograph here is actually various stages of growth. So the darker green areas are kind of old growth forest, and the lighter areas, this is where you've got replanting taking place. Now at Whitelee, a lot of that initial planting has come to be extremely profitable. There's a huge amount of felling going on at the moment, but there's also an ongoing process of restocking. So the site is in a constant state of flux with forest coups coming and forest coups going. And I must admit, it's quite bewildering at times, because you turn the corner expecting to see a forest and it's gone, and you suddenly think, have you taken a wrong turn or something? Whitelee can be an intricate place to try and navigate your way around, which is why we've invested so much time in the maps and the way markers and things like that. But even saying that, we have had to rescue a few people from site in the middle of the evenings and things like that, because they've gone for a run or gone for a walk with a dog and taken a wrong turn. This is just a couple of little photographs from inside showing you some of the tree species. So the one at the top left there is a Norway spruce, and you can tell it from the overall kind of green colour. Whereas if you look at the forest belt down the bottom there, the stand of trees on the right hand side, there's a kind of bluey hue off of it, and that's because that's more of the Sitka spruce. And the Sitka spruce, when you look at them closely, in the underside of the needles, there's actually two white stripes, which at a distance seems to give the tree a kind of blue, a bluey hue. And then at the top there, this is a pair of the random fir trees. And believe it or not, these went in at the same time, but they're much slower growing species. Other things that were planted were things like lodgepole pine, but the lodgepole pine, known as Pinus contorta, the problem with that is it doesn't take to the soil conditions, and it's missing the mycorrhizal fungi that's required to really see it grow to its true potential. And literally in this country, it's what they describe it as is a question of when it will fall over, not if. And as a timber product, it's very poor. There's actually still a couple of nice pockets of the tree sitting around, but the likelihood of it ever being harvested is very low, because it's completely twisted and gnarly timber. And that brings us to the Whitelee Habitat Management and Whitelee Habitat Management Plan. Through the planning consent for the wind farm, which is for 25 years, there was a commitment made by the wind farm developer to develop a habitat management plan for the site. The primary focus of that was to return some of the degraded areas of peat bog to a more favourable condition, and through doing that, that would have benefits for the likes of ground nesting birds, things like snipe, curlew, merlin, hen harrier, short-eared owls, things like this. And to do that, the wind farm company has committed to an extensive programme of works. The main focus of the works is this kind of central section of the wind farm here, but that's not to say that other areas haven't been brought under management as well. There's large areas over here for some of the initial trialling of new techniques, which I'll come to in a minute, were first put in place. And even in this area here, which is the back of one of the reservoirs, this is Loch Goyne Reservoir. This area here has been used for sheep grazing for a long time. The area was quite run down, it had been overgrazed for a number of years, and through the habitat management, the number of sheep on the hill was greatly reduced, which has increased the floral diversity of the area and made it more beneficial for things like ground nesting birds. Whitelee has a huge population of meadow pipits and skylarks, probably of national importance in Scotland, and they in turn obviously feed the likes of some of the raptor species. So this is one of the first techniques that basically the Windfarm company has developed, and this is used on areas where you've maybe got self-seeding of non-native spruce trees, because what's been found is that the spruce seeds remain viable in the wet peaty soil for about 5 years, and what they do is obviously they can take over and blanket an area. Also in these areas, some of the heather, so this is more of a heathland habitat in this area, because you can see it's got more heathers, and the little puffs are of white or cotton grasses. And the problem, or one of the big problems, is where you have forestry, one of the main things you need to do is to reduce the water table, otherwise the trees will drown. And if anything, in terms of peat bog, one of the worst things you can actually do to it is to introduce forestry. Where you want to have active peat deposition, where you're actually getting peat mosses forming peat for the long term, trapping CO2. And something I should have said earlier is, you know, in the peat bogs of Scotland, there's about 140 years worth equivalent of CO2 locked in peatlands. There's actually more CO2 stored in the world's peat bogs than there is in all the world's forests. And for that reason, it's really, really important to try and protect the peatland habitat. Where you have forestry, where they introduce the drains, some of them could be up to 2 meters deep and a couple of meters wide, they reduce the water table from the surface of the bog to about 80 centimeters below, which means the bog then is drying off. One of the methods that the Windfarm company came up with to try and alleviate these problems is things called wave damming, or in the case of this one, this is ground smoothing. So where you've had an area that's formerly had forestry, they will basically flip the old stumps over, drive them down into the drains, and then they will literally track and smooth over an area using a tracked excavator. And what you can see here is the top photograph shows an area that's been treated a couple of months after, and then the lower photograph shows that same area a couple of years, I think it was 3 years later. And what you're actually seeing is the return of things like the heathers, the cotton grasses, and then ultimately, if it all goes to plan, the water table will come right up, and you'll hopefully get active peat deposition there again as well. It has to be said, however, it's actually these drier areas with the heathers which are actually more beneficial for things like the ground nesting birds. So this shows you some of the areas that have been treated. So the pink areas are treated or were to be treated in 2020-21, and the orange areas are areas which have already been done. In total, there's something like 900 hectares that will be done as part of this, and it's quite an undertaking. Another technique, this is wave damming. And as somebody who used to work I've worked for Scottish Wildlife Trust, RSPB, people like this, one of the things we were constantly trying to do was dam up old drains and streams that were draining the bog. And it would literally be, 2, 3, 4 days operation to build one dam. What you can see here with a series of pits in the top left-hand corner is what they have actually developed as a technique where they use a bog tracked excavator, which can literally create a dam in a stream or a drain that is draining the bog in between 45 to 60 seconds. And what they actually do is they put in a series of these peat dams and then eventually they work back and they smooth over the whole area, which is what you can see in the bottom right photograph. And then ultimately, after 2-3 years, the top right photograph, that shows you what you can actually achieve. So basically that draining of the bog has actually been stopped, and you're starting to get the formation of mosses and grasses and things. It's a successional process, and the whole programme, if it all goes to plan, they're expecting will take about 7 years. It could take as long as 10 years. But as I say, one of the main things is to stop that draining of the peat bog. And the little map down the bottom there, that shows you all the areas that have actually had this treatment. One of the big things that was done at the start of the wind farm was there was roughly 900 hectares of non-native woodland was taken out of an area where the peat bog needed protected. And the idea there was to try and get that, as I say, back to a more favourable condition. And this brings us to the last problem that I did touch on earlier, which is the self-seeding of the spruce trees. When Forestry Commission started planting Whitelee forest in the 1960s, they were doing it at around 700 stems per hectare. Restocking levels now are about 1,000 stems per hectare. That forces nice straight pole growth without lots of side branching. However, what was found was in areas with self-seeding, the stems were coming in between 15 and 18,000 stems per hectare. They were blanketing whole areas, and everything below was just basically been choked out. So another thing they developed was this kind of scraping or toothing method, where they raked off the young sapling trees, and they would literally track and crush them down into the peat bog and treat areas in this fashion. And again, what the survey results were showing afterwards was, where in the past the water table was down at 80 centimetres or 70 centimetres below ground level, within a year to 2 years they had it within 20 centimetres, and in a lot of areas it was actually within 2 or 3 centimetres of the surface. And what that then meant was you were starting to get a return of the bog species, the bog sphagnums and things like that. Which brings us nicely onto kind of lighter section of my talk. So this is, and something I should have said, is all the photographs through today, apart from the ones just there to do with the specifics of the work that Scottish Power Renewables have been doing. All of these are our own photographs, and this is just some of the things that we find around the site. So top left hand side is a flowering blaeberry plant, which is a distant relative of the American blueberry. Whitelee is absolutely chocker full of these things. They're absolutely delicious, and they're packed full of goodness for you. And one of the things we often get asked is, how do you know when they're ready to eat? And it's the simplest thing in the world. You look for bright purple bird poo, because once you find the birds are eating them, they're good for us. Other things as we go across, this is reindeer lichen, the kind of white blob, and we're starting to see in areas where management has brought about changes, we're starting to see reindeer lichen starting to appear, and a stand like that can literally take hundreds of years to form. Next to that, you have a fairly typical peat hag or bog pool, where the peat is particularly liquid, and certainly in the case of that one with the peat probe, we've probed it down past a couple of meters. And then next to that, believe it or not, is bluebells, which is a bit of an oddity because bluebells are an ancient woodland indicator, but there are several areas of the wind farm where we know, going right back probably to Iron Age times, there was woodland cover in the area. So another thing we occasionally find is greater wood rush, which is another ancient woodland indicator species. So you find these potted around the place. Over on the left hand side, the beautiful yellow flower is bog asphodel. The nice thing I like about that is, us canny Scots, we used to use the pollen is bright yellow, And rather than spending exorbitant amounts of money on saffron, people used to pinch some of the stamens out the plant, put that in the rice to get saffron rice. Below that, you have the bog cotton, or hare's tail cotton grass, which is one of the first kind of pioneer grasses, or strictly speaking, it's actually a sedge that has been, we've seen to move into the areas where the active management has been done. And then right next to that, we've got round-leaved sundew. So that's one of the insectivorous bug-eating plants, and you get that particularly on the wetter areas of the peat bog. And there's areas now that are absolutely covered in that. And thankfully, they do like eating midges. And then right next to that is a nice close-up of heather. And heather is really important for the really large population of red grouse that's in the Windfarm at Whitelee. There is black grouse in the Windfarm as well. The last time there was a count, I believe there was only 2 at that point. As you probably know, black grouse are not doing well throughout Scotland, but they are still present at the Windfarm, and there is active management for them. This is a couple of photographs of main peat bog species. So this is Sphagnum capifolium and Sphagnum magellum, and these are the plants that really form the peat that underlies the area. And these are the species that, in terms of carbon sequestration, you really want, because these are the guys which absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, lock it inside, and then year upon year, as a new layer of the bog moss grows, that trapped CO2 goes down into the ground to form the peat bog. The other interesting thing about this is the photograph below, which is actually of nurses who are sifting through great piles of dried out sphagnum moss, which used to be collected from areas like Whitelee during the First and Second World Wars, because bog moss comes out the bog completely sterile, and it can hold 20 times its weight in water. So it was actually used in the wars as a wound dressing, and it didn't need any of the treatments that other things would. This little plant you can see here, that's my finger, just illustrating the size of it. This is a little phalloid leafy liverwort called veilwort. It's probably about the rarest plant within the Windfarm. And what's quite interesting was when the Windfarm was constructed, Whitelee was the only site that this plant had been found in Scotland. There's now another site in Dumfries and Galloway. And what was noticed at the time was it only seemed to be growing in stands of deergrass. And in a resurvey that my colleague and I did with a gentleman from Scottish Natural Heritage, what we actually noticed on that survey was it was only appearing in the nest chambers and runs of voles round about those grass tussocks of the deergrass. So a really, really specialised habitat requirement at Whitelee, whereas if you actually go down into England, you'll find it growing in rocky outcrops in various places, but currently about the rarest plant found at the Windfarm. Not a huge amount of fungi are found in upland sites, but nonetheless, we've got 52 species recorded so far. What I should say is when the Ranger Service started, there was actually no Phase 1 records or NBC records or anything like that were provided to us. There was very little known. So all these records have been built up just through incidental observations, our own surveys and things over time. So a few of the interesting ones here. Bottom left is a thing called the scarlet wax cap, which is actually a red data list species. So one that's a priority species in LBAPs. More interesting for me as someone who finds mushrooms fascinating is the one right next to it, is the false chanterelle. And the reason it's more interesting is I do like to let people know don't be tricked into eating it, because it's the one you don't eat. The weirdest of the bunch is the horribleness above. This is the only slime mold we've found in the site, and this one has the wonderful name of dog sick slime mold. And what is really bizarre about this stuff is the kind of black bit you can see at the back of the yellow is actually part of the same organism. they actually start in different locations and then they move incredibly slowly towards one another, and then they coalesce to form an entirely new organism. And if you're interested by any of that stuff, if you look up slime molds, they are actually quite fascinating organisms. In terms of the bird life for the wind farm, there's currently 101 species have been recorded. 25 of them are red list species of conservation concern. There's also 9 raptor species, everything from hen harriers to short-eared owls, tawny owls, barn owls, peregrines, merlins, hen harriers, a huge assemblage of birds. We now have regular nesting swallows and house martins that make use of the ranger cabin, the visitor centre, the control centre for the wind farm. And as I was saying earlier, a lot of the work that's actually been done for the purposes of the vegetation has the added benefit of having a positive impact for the birds. There were some impacts at the beginning just through disturbance from construction, things like that. But over time, what we are actually seeing is an increase in our sightings of most of these birds. And it's certainly something that's ongoing for the wind farm company, is they carry out regular bird monitoring and things like this. So what you can see there is a red grouse, curlew. In the centre there's little skylark. We have some resident pairs of ravens, which have become incredibly adept at bin raiding. I have actually witnessed them training their young how to do it. And then below them you have a common sandpiper, and then the short-eared owl. And the nice thing with the owls is if they have yellow owl eyes, they're day flying. Black eyes, night flying, and if it's orange eyes, they're crepuscular, which means they're your kind of dusk and dawns. We've regularly seen the short-eared owls up at the visitor centre and right through sight. At the moment, we have 15 mammal species that have been recorded, everything from brown hares, which is another LBAT priority species, pipistrelle bats, pine martens, otters, badgers, right down to field mice. The pine marten there, I will admit, is not one of our photographs. It's a friend of mine who was working at an adjoining wind farm, and that is actually a pine marten checking out an otter holt. However, we did actually know that there were pine martens in the site because Vincent Wildlife Trust had carried out some survey work in previous years and identified them through SCAT surveys. My personal favourites, we have a huge population of herpetofauna, or amphibians and reptiles. Exactly what you would find, expect to find in upland sites. So we have frogs, toads and palmate newts. These are the only ones that are tolerant of acidic bog pools. But we also have a huge population of common lizards that go from one side of the wind farm to the other, and a strong population of the UK's only venomous snake, the adder. And the little centre photograph, that is actually the adder hiding underneath the tyre of our 4x4, and it was myself who got the unpleasant job of trying to gently persuade it to get out the way of our vehicle. And these are guys which, you know, upland sites, particularly for the adder, have become the kind of last refuge for them. Sadly, when Whitelee Forest was planted, one of the first things the Forest Commission at the time did was send in the trappers to basically kill anything that could potentially impact on the forest crop or anything that was a potential threat to the workers. And they eradicated the adder from large areas of the site. So the hope is that over time we might actually see them spreading a wee bit further. And they're one that we've certainly done active surveys for over the years. And then the final things is the invertebrates. And so far we've identified 149 different species. The main things, or the biggest kind of group of that, is the moths, which are tolerant to the harsh conditions up there. So that's the large emperor moth. You can actually see at the top there. We also have one of the UK's largest dragonflies, which is the one in the centre, which is the common hawker. And we've got everything from beetles to hoverflies, bumblebees, and the fact of the matter is this is changing all the time. We've actually seen a couple of new species arriving in the site just within the last couple of years, probably linked to climate change. In total, therefore, what we have is roughly 375 floral species in total have been recorded for the site, 108 herbs, 24 different species of trees, 6 ferns, 41 species of grasses, sedges and rushes, 52 fungi, 1 slime mold, and 103 different lichen species, 5 of which are of national importance to the site. And yeah, a lot of people come now. The big draw is the bird life, but we also get plant hunters, we get food foragers, we get all different types. And as I say, our priority there is to help facilitate that. And then just a final one, this is the phenological recording. Since I started the site in 2010, I've been doing the phenology of different species. And this is a table I've built up over that time, and it shows just how consistent the plants and the animals are in terms of their timing to the seasons and everything else. And that is me. I hope that was of interest.
That was a really interesting talk. I think that was just what we were looking for. Really, that was ideal. I mean, I thought it was you know, really interesting to hear you know, how well, one of the things I was aware of at Whitelee was that in terms of removing trees from the bog, that was something you were supposed to be doing, and a few years back there was a real struggle with self-seeding, so it's good to see that you'd overcome that. And also just interesting to look at the wave damming and how much that had reduced the grasses, millennia and things, and got it back to a more bog habitat, because I'm quite keen on peatlands. But
Absolutely.
so I'll maybe kick off with a first question, and then other people can come in with questions. If I can get my screen to show where everybody is, so I can see where everybody is. But my first question was, that whiskey bottle, is it full or is it empty?
It's about half empty. What's more concerning is there's actually there's a small valley on the East Ayrshire side, and some years ago I've been heavily involved with a walking festival from the Irvine Valley Trust, and they planted a bottle of whiskey up there, and the idea was we went to an area that a local shepherd always used to take his flock and have a little nip of whiskey, and the idea was everybody on the walk was going to have a nip of whiskey, and they lost the ruddy bottle, and loads of people have been back looking for it and we cannot find it. What I think has happened, Whitelee's quite notorious. If you put up a trail camera, we advise you to do it at night, because there's so many people in the area that trail cameras get nicked, and I think somebody saw the bottle of whiskey going in and thought, brilliant.
So anybody else, any questions?
There's not. I'm going to ask a question about the conifer woodland. I mean, from your contacts with the Windfarm company, do you think that the woodland planting would take a radically different form if the farm was being proposed these days?
I'm not entirely sure on that one, if I'm absolutely honest. I mean, I think at the end of the day, from the wind farm operator's point of view, the ideal landscape for them is the open moorland site, where they get a really clean wind resource blowing through. As soon as the wind starts hitting into the woodland belts, you get a lot of turbulent air, which puts a lot more stresses and strains on the turbines. However, at the same time, speaking to the managers over the years, I think they're generally just grateful of the fact that, you know, Forestry Commission does have these large land holdings all over Scotland that where a wind farm can, you know, work alongside the forestry. I mean, one of the things we certainly tell people is, you know, Whitelee is an excellent example of a multi-use site. We get a lot of students from universities coming out to look at it because you have water catchment with 3 reservoirs in the northern end of the site. You've got Forestry Commission with their timber crop. You have several private landowners with sheep and cattle. You've got other private landowners who own some of the private forestry coops. And then overlaying all of that, you have the wind farm operators. So in terms of land management, you have all of this going on. And then on top of that, you have public access. And right now, and particularly since the whole coronavirus thing, you know, Whitelee has been an incredibly popular site to the point that, you know, during the kind of peak of the coronavirus, you could not get into a car park. The roads in the surrounding area were parked as well. So going back to your question, I would say in an ideal world, they probably would love it if the trees were all kept away or nice and low. But at the same time, as I say, I think they're just thankful that you've got a large land area that is available for the wind farm.
Right, thanks.
Can I ask if you have any imitators of this approach of having a multi-use site?
It's hard to say. I mean, Janet and I were just talking at the beginning. I'm only aware of one other site in Scotland which has a ranger service, for example. It's Dornell Ranger Service, and they very much came down and had a look at Whitelee and what was being done. There are lots of examples of wind farms on forestry or wind farms on farmland. I don't, in all honesty, know if you have another site with the complexity of land ownership and, you know, as I say, agriculture, water catchment and forestry all going on at the same time. And it's certainly, as I say, it's something that we get a lot of students coming out to look at, but we also get a huge number of international visitors from all around the world, because one of the things that makes this all quite unique is the Land Reform Scotland Act and the Scottish Outdoor Access Code, which obviously overlies all of this and gives us all a right of access. Apart from a very, very limited number of places, you know, Ministry of Defence land, things that make perfect sense. But you know, we get visitors from the US, from Canada. We had a delegation from the Polish government some years ago who said, if you go to a wind farm in our country, you will be met by locked gates. It's that simple. So I honestly don't know if there's another one out there with this complexity. And also, I certainly know from talking to the wind farm managers, what they tell me is there are no other Whitelees in Scotland in terms of the scale of the wind farm and the availability of the resource there. They reckon this is about as big as it'll ever get, but it's been a hugely productive site for timber, for agriculture, for water, and for the wind farm. I mean, Whitelee's hit full output on numerous occasions, which is quite something for a wind farm.
It's interesting that people haven't imitated it then.
It is. I mean, internationally, I think there are. I mean, well, I know, for example, there's a wind farm in England where you can actually go up inside of a turbine and onto a viewing platform at the top. I must admit, I wish to God they'd put one of them at Whitelee, because it's one of the common questions we get asked is, can we go inside? Can we have a look? And unfortunately, we just can't. And as I say, we do get a lot of people. In fact, we've got a delegation of countryside rangers coming from Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park, on Friday, not to see the wind farm per se, but just to see how we manage access and the interpretation materials and the visitor centre and this type of thing. So a lot of people do come and they take bits of it away. It's just whether or not, as I say, you have that other site with all the different interests of land management going on at the same time. Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah. comment in the chat from Laura, who I know is having problems with her broadband, to say it's lovely to see this area now. Knew part of it back in the early 1970s through a university friend who grew up in the area, and it was sad to see the unused farms. Well, I mean, I suppose some of the sheelings are unused still, but at least people are visiting them and appreciating the history, I guess. That
the Windfarm company, they've certainly used some of the old farmsteads, things like that. Some other people moved away, but the visitor centre, I'm trying to remember the exact figures now, but I think it's between the visitor centre and all the entrances to the wind farm, there's well over 100,000 people a year coming. And in fact, I was speaking to a gentleman just last week who was having his 84th birthday this week. And when he was a 15-year-old boy, he used to come up onto the moors and get paid a shilling to be a grouse beater. Because that's one of the other things that used to go on at the wind farm. You know, this was a shooting area. There was a lot going on in terms of rearing partridge, pheasant, grouse, and obviously that's all ended now as well. But we've actually we found a couple of the old grouse butts out in the site as well, and we've reported them to local archaeologists, and they've gone out and investigated them, because some of them are very plush with flagstone floors and everything.
If you are wanting to encourage more wind farms to take this approach, who might we, from our perspective, who might we look to support wider public access and the establishment of RANA services, etc. In particular, in existing farms, because we've got all the Clyde wind farms just up the Clyde from here.
Sure.
What can I ask? What's the Scottish Government's view of this, and what are the local authorities' views, given that they are the two consenting authorities?
Well, certainly in terms of how the Whitelee Access Project, the Whitelee Ranger Service came about, was through the planning process that went into Whitelee Wind Farm and the consultations with the local community. Now, obviously, the respective authorities, they all act as the access authorities. So each council respectively is an access authority for its area. And what essentially happened with Whitelee is, you know, the three councils got together, looked at what was being proposed. We're looking at the likes of the consultation information and all the rest of it and the feedback. And then my understanding, and unfortunately I wasn't there at that stage, but my understanding is what was put forward was a proposal for the Whitelee Access Project. In terms of what I would say in terms of trying to look for that kind of benefit for the future, if it is a future planned wind farm, then it's really discussing these the ideas and what's gone on before with the relevant planning authorities, who also have the access officers or somebody responsible for access will generally be in the planning department or the environment department attached to that. I would say it's probably going to be a bit trickier if you've already got an existing wind farm, but then there's maybe an opportunity to be approaching, depending on what the area is, you know, an existing ranger service and a wind farm operator, and saying, you know, through a community benefit fund, can we look at an opportunity for the creation of a new ranger post? And that new ranger post will be responsible for, you know, public access within the wind farms or something like that. I mean, one thing I didn't explain at the start, just because of the timing, was basically how it works is for each megawatt that's installed in the respective council areas, there is a payment that goes from the wind farm company to the council. And the bulk of that money is used in community good funds that local communities can apply to for environmental projects and things like that. And a small portion of that is used for the Whitelee Access Project, which we, the Ranger Service, are a part of. And that is really something, as I say, that through the Section 75 agreement and the planning process, those are really within the powers of the planning authorities. And as you guys probably, you know, I mean, the people, with the real power in terms of conservation and everything are the planning authorities, really. You know, I mean, as I say, I started off my life as a volunteer of Scottish Wildlife Trust and all these conservation organisations, but the real power is with the planning authorities, and that these are the guys I would certainly say to engage with, and to say, you know, look at Whitelee, look at how beneficial it has been in terms of the numbers of people. There's numbers that are coming for outdoor access, for health, the number of school children coming, the community benefit through the Community Good Fund and all these types of things.
And is your post or the ranger posts funded by the local authorities through planning gain or otherwise, or is it funded directly by the Windfarm?
It's basically the funding goes from the Windfarm to the local authority, and then the local authorities jointly fund the Whitelee Access project. It has chopped and changed a wee bit over the years. Initially, Whitelee Access project and the Ranger Service were funded by the 3 local authority areas, but the Access project is now still funded by the 3 local authorities, but the Ranger Service is only funded by 2 of them. Just the way things have worked out over the years.
And I had a question about your areas where you've got bluebells and signs of there being ancient broadleaf woodland. Are those areas being replanted with broadleafs or managed in a way to encourage, if there is still a seed bank of broadleaf there, for that to regenerate? They
aren't at the moment, I must admit. And in fact, these areas have tended to be in the sheep grazing areas. There are areas of the Windfarm Forestry Commission is now moving away to a degree from only using the likes of the non-native Sitka spruce and Norway spruce. And there's a much larger component now, which is of native downy birch. And what you would hope to see over time is, as that kind of develops, if it's on the same kind of 25 or 40 year rotation, is you will hopefully start to see the natural encroachment by the likes of these things. But no, unfortunately not. I mean, the major kind of conservation projects of the site, as I say, is primarily focused on the peat bog and the peat bog ecology. However, what I would say is I would fully expect that at the end of the consented 25 years for Whitelee, it looks incredibly likely that they will apply for the site to be re-energised. And at that point, that would obviously, you would expect to include a review of the management and everything that's gone before, and that might be an opportunity at that point. We as a ranger service did try to establish some small copse of willow carr in places. Unfortunately, the sheep are so damaging. We couldn't get them established, and they just kept getting in and destroying the plantings, unfortunately. But as I say, that there may be opportunities for that in the future.
Any other questions for?
Just add 1 or 2 quick questions. Which of the local authorities that you deal with, or who oversee it?
So we are based with East Renfrewshire Council, so we actually work out of East Renfrewshire Council and are based there, and the other 2 councils are East Ayrshire and South Lanarkshire. And if you're interested in that kind of side of things, if you go on to the likes of the homepages of them all and look for the likes of Community Good Fund, Windfarm Community Good Fund, you should be able to find information about the various funding pots linked to the Windfarm there as well.
That's useful, because obviously we deal with South Lanarkshire. In the case of Clyde, the original Clyde Windfarm, of course, South Lanarkshire managed their community funds.
Yep.
But so we have various relationships with South Lanarkshire. Wind farms, quite a lot of them.
Each local authority and each wind farm development, certainly from what I've read over the years, seems to have had different approaches and different funding streams and targets and all the rest of it. Going back to one of your questions earlier about Scottish Government involvement, you know, I've certainly not had any direct involvement from Scottish Government or them saying X, Y, or Z or things. It's very much been down to each individual local authority. So I actually don't know if they have a view in the overall way things get done. As I say, the way I view it these days is I think Whitelee, in terms of the public access, the education, the community good and all the rest of it has been really quite beneficial. And in terms of the conservation management, you know, as I was saying, you know, my background, we could only dream of, you know, tackling areas at the scale that the wind farm company is having to do through the planning consent for the site. You know, it's very much the moves of the major players like RSPB, SWT towards landscape scale conservation, and really what you are looking at here at Whitelee is landscape scale, and it has the added benefit of creating opportunities in the surrounding areas to the wind farm as well. Yeah, we could only dream of the things that were being done at Whitelee when I was working for SWT and people, and we were scratching around for a few quid for small projects.
Yeah.
Does a case study of the management work at Whitelee exist that is tailored to councils and planning authorities that can be presented as a case for best practice to see similar management models be adopted at existing wind farms? I'm not aware of anything myself, I must admit, but that's not to say that the wind farm company haven't done something themselves that I'm not aware of. But what I do know is the likes of their ecology team, they do a lot of work in consultation and in cooperation with the likes of RSPB, Nature Scot now, as it was SNH in my day, and people like this. And you know, they've actually won awards for some of the new techniques. And funnily enough, I actually had a chap from Scottish Water who came into a ranger cabin just yesterday, and he said that, and you'll probably know this, that there is now a massive focus in the UK on peatland management, and he had actually been sent up to the site. He was actually going to access Scottish Water land holdings just outside of the wind farm. And when I got chatting to him, he said, yeah, it's because we've got a huge focus now on management of peatlands for carbon sequestration. And when chatting to him, the techniques that they're proposing and using were some of the techniques that have literally been pioneered by the wind farm operator at Whitelee. So I suspect there's probably case studies possibly within that kind of specific area on peatland management and things like that that are probably out there. And I certainly know, I mean, maybe about 8 years ago, I went to a presentation by Scottish Power Renewables lead ecologist, where he was talking to various conservation bodies, government ministers, all the rest of it, and it was specifically on the habitat management, the peatland management, and what they were achieving. So I would certainly suggest that would be an area to look at. Brilliant, thank you. It was a really good talk as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
If there are no other questions, I'd really just like to thank Rennie for coming along, and it was a really spot on talk, I think, for what we were looking for. And just, yeah, thank you for your time, giving up your evening to come along and talk to us, albeit remotely. And perhaps at some point in the future we can maybe do a summer visit or something to Whitelee, because we do have some visits in the summer, so it'd be maybe nice to actually get out and get our feet wet and muddy and see it at some point. Have a look round.
Yeah, certainly try to do that.
That in all honesty, you know, me withering on over the internet is one thing. I would suggest it is well worth a visit. You know, if you've got questions and you want to see it on the ground, it's absolutely worth a visit. You know, the Ranger Service is there, the project officer is there.
we can point out some of the key areas and things you can very, very easily go and have a look at in terms of habitat management and all the rest of it. And the fact of the matter is, if you come up during the summer, it's the only place in Scotland I know of where you will come up to a visitor centre and you will get skylarks on the lawn in front of it, singing their hearts out. It's actually fantastic in the summer, it really is. And the centre's a hive of activity with house martins, swallows, all the rest of it. It's definitely, it's well worth a visit. I can't recommend it enough.
Have you seen, could I have a sneaky question, which I think can be asked quite quickly, but is there any species that started going down the way since you've been managing the land in this way?
It's what I would always say on that one is it'll be a long-term study. We'll produce the results on that. Yep. There was indications through the Whitelee Habitat Management Group early on that some of the bird species had been negatively impacted. However, with the level of construction and disturbance that was going on at that time, it's completely understandable. When Whitelee 1 was being constructed, they reckon it was probably the largest construction project in Europe at that time, with about 6 borrow pits or quarries on the go, machines and all the rest of it. So what I suspect, and this is just my personal suspicion, is quite a lot of the bird species probably moved out into some of the surrounding woodland areas. As I say, Whitelee Forest extends right out from the wind farm. But as things have settled down, I mean, from what, and this is just anecdotal, from what I'm seeing is numbers definitely bouncing back, if not going up. I mean, there's red grouse right up to the doors of the visitor centre and things like this. It's questionable whether or not the kind of larger impact long term will be public access. One of the biggest user groups of the wind farm is dog walkers, which is fantastic. It's a fantastic place to walk the dog. We have an event there called Nay Fireworks Night, which actually got international attention because we created a quiet space for people with dogs that are terrified of fireworks. And certainly disturbance from people who are not following the access code. Responsible access is the key thing to it. Can have a negative impact, but this is where having a ranger service on the ground to, you know, challenge any behaviours, to educate and all the rest of it.
I guess things like Molinia will have decreased, and that's something you want to decrease, you know, sort of, you know, so the grasses on the bogs, so you know, those sort of things will have decreased, but they're not things you want to encourage. So
this is it. I mean, there is a kind of more of a heathland component. It's an area that was already quite significantly dried off. It used to suffer from muir burn and things like that in the past. Now that's an area where the wind farm were doing flailing to try and stimulate nice new growth of the heather, and obviously that has the benefit of the Molinias and things like this, which were bouncing back from that as well. But yeah, the main one, as I say, is peat bog in terms of the peat deposition, which they were looking for again. What I've certainly noticed is after initial works, you get a flush of juncus, then the Molinias come, and then shortly after that, once things start to settle down, they then start to recede, and that's when you start to get your sphagnum mosses and things like that coming back. As I say, very much a successional process, and it will be one that will be, I mean, there is numerous PhD studies in the site for people to do on things like this, and I'm quite sure that will come out over time.
And I mean, a lot of the anti-wind lobby focuses on bird strikes, which I think some of that evidence came from wind farms that were on migration routes in California and therefore aren't relevant to here. I mean, do you get bird strikes, and if so, how many, what sorts of birds?
There obviously are bird strikes. As I say, I've been there 12 years, and I can count on both hands and toes the number that I've personally seen or heard of.
There, you know, if you look at the research papers, there's question marks over how many of them are actually discovered in terms of, you know, what's the ratio that's found, how many get picked up by scavengers like foxes and carrion feeders and things like this. What I would say is the ones that I know of and that I have seen, so all the turbines are painted the same colour when they get to that scale. It's chosen by the Scottish Government. It's universal to all turbines of that size. It's a really depressing fact that that wishy-washy grey colour they are is the day of a typical Scottish skyline. And the intention behind that is to reduce the visual impact of the turbines, which, if I'm honest, I mean, I would say any impact on wildlife is of greater importance than visual impact, but that's just my opinion. But what it does mean is if you get heavy fog, you get heavy rain, mist, things like that, what I've certainly noticed is it's the birds that tend to fly quite low to the ground when quartering. So I've seen things like mallards, red grouse, snipe, and it's not a case, as many people, you know, there's this misconception, I think, that, and I've had people say to me, oh, wind turbines are just big mincing machines, but I've never seen or heard of one actually going and being hit by the blade. Generally, and sadly, what has happened is they've flown into the towers. And in fact, the visitor centre has had probably more bird deaths than the turbines, as I'm aware of, just because they have a lovely glass fronted window at the cafe, which is fantastic for sitting looking out at the views. But the downside is things like meadow pipits, wagtails, things like that. As we all know, and we've all had it in our houses, they fly into the windows. It is a fact that bird strikes do occur. One of the things I can show as an example of that is I have several pairs of bird wings and bird feet that I use for educational purposes, and some of them are recovered from some of the birds that have flown into turbines. We actually had a red grouse. There's a large turbine blade display near the visitor centre. It's actually one of the blades that's laid out, and a red grouse actually flew into that. So as I say, it's more, unfortunately, these birds that come in low to the ground or pop up, fly low to the ground and land again. Anything that we have ever found or we've had reported to us by members of the public immediately gets passed to the site manager, gets passed to the ecology team, and there's an investigation takes place. Even if it's only pieces, as in, you know, a fox has found the cadaver, or you know, something's been pecking at it. I mean, I've literally sent away some internal organs and bits before, and they have managed to get that identified. But as I say, it's been things like the red grouse and things, but then the counterbalance to that is the active management, which has increased the habitat opportunities, opportunities and everything else. To my mind, the thing that will really tell the tale is, you know, at the end of the 25 years, when there's a resurvey, and I would expect a major resurvey, or I would hope for a major resurvey, to look at what the numbers are doing there, what's the spread through the site,